Welcome, dear viewer. This is Derpy. And can you believe that it's already 2019? For going for 3 years we've been playing this game. Kinda crazy, isn't it? Well, if you're still playing Dark Souls 3 like me, I suppose we should look at an approach that is seldom ever seen in Dark Souls 3 PvP and discuss whether or not it is quote unquote viable. So if you're watching this video, you either caught it from my channel or you somehow misclicked and ended up here. Either way, I'm going to assume that you know basic PvP mechanics in Dark Souls 3 and how status effects work. But just in case some newcomers who may not be as experienced, I want to give a solid foundation of how status effects work. So we'll just start from the basics and we'll work our way up. So what status effects are available to the player? There is Frostbite, Bleed, Poison, and Toxic. Keep in mind that each status effect varies by source, accumulation, and damage. To see if a weapon has a status effect already, go to the specific weapon stat screen and look for a section called Additional Effects. If there is a number next to one of those 3 icons, then congratulations. This means it has an innate status effect. If your weapon doesn't have any status effects, don't worry, there's another method you can try that I'll explain later on in the video. But now let's take a look at a player's main defense against a status, which is resistance. To check how much you have, go to your character's stat screen and look towards the bottom right. Resistance, which is the column on the left, is your total added from your base resistance and the resistance gained from your armor. The armor column tells you how much resistance is gained from the armor you're wearing. If you want to find out how much base resistance you have, all you have to do is take off your armor and check your stats again. Just something to keep in mind, the higher resistance you have, the longer your status bar will be whenever you get hit by a status effect. Not only that, it will take longer for a status buildup to go away if you have such high resistance. So basically, if you have a low status resistance, it will take a shorter amount of time for it to disappear versus if you have high resistance. Just something that you should think about. During PvP, if you want to find out how status buildup and resistance work together, say for example your opponent has 150 resistance and you have a weapon that does 30 status buildup. It will take 5 hits for the status to proc, although it might take more because status buildup decreases as soon as it's inflicted. And if you're not fighting mashed potato brain players, you probably won't be able to land that many hits in such a short time span anyway. But sometimes spam or trading can happen and that's what you're looking for. Now that you understand how resistance and status buildup works, let's take a look at the different status effects, starting with my personal favorite, Poison. Before I get ahead of myself, I should mention that Poison is probably going to be the least talked about status effect, mainly because there's already a great video about Poison by the YouTuber DangItJM. In his video, he'll talk about how good Poison is in PvE, PvP, and also how it's been changed throughout the game's lifespan. And rather than to repeat the info that's already been shared, I'll leave a link to the video in the description, and if you haven't already watched it, definitely go do it. It is a great watch. So to give an overview of poison inflicted by a player, it is a damage over time status effect that lasts 90 seconds, can hit during iframes, and has a base damage of 630 plus 6.3% of an opponent's total HP, which makes it the second most damaging status effect in the game. Not only that, it is arguably the easiest status effect to proc due to the tools available to you as a player. Remember how I said if your weapon doesn't have any innate status effects not to worry, because there is another method you could try? Let's take a look at that. There are two consumable items that you can use to buff your weapon with a status effect. There are only two though, Ron Pine Resin and Carthus Rouge, which we'll talk about later on. Ron Pine Resin applies 45 poison buildup to any buffable weapon, which is more buildup than any weapon with innate poison. This buff alone makes most weapons incredibly easy to apply poison with. And if you really want to apply that poison, buffing a innate poison weapon with Ron Pine Resin, it is incredibly dumb. I'm talking like 3 to 5 hits, you'll probably proc poison on majority of players. Alright. So, I've been talking about the good things about poison, and I've been trying to make a case as to why someone would consider using poison. But now let me talk about the bad, which is kinda where people start having some conflicting opinions about poison in invasions. So let me just briefly discuss about it. So with poison being so easy to proc, it also has the most amount of cures in the game. And you have to preoccupy your opponent for 90 seconds if you want the full amount of damage to be inflicted. Another disadvantage, or well, I guess it kinda depends on how you see it. Poison being a damage over time status effect doesn't really have a immediate payoff as soon as it procs. So most players will pop a cure via purple moss or blooming purple moss in order to cure their poison, and they don't mind tanking some hits if it means they cure their poison. So you could argue that it leaves them open for retaliation and a window to attack, although that kind of varies on how useful that is in my experience. Another method of curing poison that I sometimes see, I mainly saw it during mid to low level invasions, is a miracle called Caressing Tears. And if you don't know what Caressing Tears is, it's an AoE that cures the user and their allies of a status effect. Not just poison, it cures them of all the status effects and their buildup, except for toxic for some reason. I'm not sure why that is. But it's a pretty decent miracle, all things considered. An AoE that cures your party of status effects, 14 FP to cast, 12 faith is dirt cheap. So really anyone can use it. It's just it does take a little while to cast. Plus you have to stand still. You can hold it just like a Great Heal or Heal Miracle. So, you know, that's another thing that you could encounter whenever you're trying to inflict a status effect, not just poison. So to save some time, I'm just going to list some pros, cons, and some scenarios to where poison could be what you're looking for. I view poison from a utility standpoint instead of a damage one, but don't get me wrong, it can definitely do some damage, but you know, the con for it is it takes time in order to do that, plus it's really easy to cure, so it really depends on how you play and how aggressive you are, in my opinion. Of course, it may vary. In terms of weaponry to inflict poison, I'd recommend going with the Gru Arsenal. Their weapons are actually pretty decent, borderline good, just because of the fact they have innate poison. And also Spotted Whip to some extent, it does have its uses, and can even excel in some scenarios. But do not, and I repeat, do not use a Store's Spear for poison, alright? As much as I love that thing, it is definitely not on par with a Gru Spear. If you want to use a weapon to deal poison damage and a spear, go for the Gru, not a Store's. So, is poison good? Well, yeah. I think the biggest hurdle for people to overcome whenever they're going to try and use poison is to keep in mind that it is the second most damaging status effect, but it is a damage over time. And anything you can do to keep your opponent from curing it, that is what you're going to have to try and do if you want to make the full use of poison in an invasion. Now that we're done with poison, let's move on to the coolest status effect introduced in the game, Frostbite. I haven't mentioned a very important detail that I'm going to mention right now that involves the statuses and how they changed. A patch that made status effects pretty balanced in my opinion. The patch 1.11. Probably the saving grace for all the status effects, except for maybe bleed, but that's debatable. Anyways, this patch came out a while ago. It came out in the 23rd of March, 2017. For right now, we'll just focus on Frostbite, and we'll come back to this whenever we get to the other status effects. The problem with Frostbite that thankfully it doesn't have anymore was build-up. See, the tools and weapons that you had just didn't cause enough Frostbite against a player. In PvE, I'd say it worked fine, and now it just demolishes it, but the reason why Frostbite was changed is because Frostbite was almost impossible, or it was unreasonably difficult to proc. But one thing FromSoft never changed was the damage and the effects that Frostbite causes. Frostbite is interesting in that it's a burst damage status and a debuff. The debuff reduces stamina regen and increases all incoming damage by 7% for 15 seconds. The base damage is 85, plus an additional 11% of an opponent's total HP. So the properties of this status offers a playstyle of burst damage to get that extra kick that might just be what you need to finish an opponent, or it can serve as a utility debuff that cripples your opponent and makes them weaker for a short duration. To balance all of these really amazing qualities, only a few weapons and spells have innate frost. The Outrider weapons all have innate frost, including Vorts, and the Pontiff Knight weapons are special in that the Pontiff Scythe does an initial frost AoE and applies frost to its attacks, while the Pontiff Curved Sword has frost on its weapon art attack. Could you imagine if Pontiff Knight Curved Sword had innate frost? Thank God. And there's also the case of Freed Scythes, which also has innate frost and is generally seen wielded by a phantom that spams the weapon art. That has range, causes a lot of stagger, hyper armor, and costs no FP. It also requires having investment in order to deal any significant damage anyway, so these are the weapons that have frost. As for spells and equipment, there are no consumables like a resin, and it can't be infused on a weapon either. As for spells, Snap Freeze and Frozen Weapon can help you to inflict frost. Snap Freeze is a sorcery-based AoE that blankets the area in front of your character in an air of frost that does 15 frost buildup per tick to any target in range. It's also useful for area denial, wombo combos, or obscuring additional casts. And the other spell is Frozen Weapon, which applies 48 frost buildup to any buffable weapon, which is quite a lot. It's even more than Ron Pine Resin. It's rarely seen, but is usually paired with Cell Swords or paired weapons, due to the fact that paired weapons can deal more status buildup with their L1s, which works surprisingly well. It's also the only status effect buff that's a spell in the entire game. These tools are what you will have at your disposal whenever you want to inflict Frostbite. The most accessible frost weapons, in my opinion, are the Irithyll, Rapier, and Straight Sword. It helps that these weapons are relatively early in the game to get. The Straight Sword can be found after Undead Settlement once you defeat the Irithyll Knight, Whereas the rapier requires a little more effort since you have to beat the dancer. But I'd say you're probably just fine with the straight sword if you don't want to get the rapier. The setup that you'll see me using if I want to use Frostbite is the Irithyll straight sword in my main hand and the rapier in the offhand. Something about this setup is just so much more fun than, say, like Vorts or something. While Vorts is insane when it comes to build up, I prefer the Irithyll straight sword and rapier setup. But that's just me, of course. If you want to go for a poise frost weapon, Vorts is going to be your favorite, I'm sure. So let me talk a little bit about curing Frostbite, which I would personally consider an advantage that this status effect has. Frostbite can be cured by the usual Divine Blessing or Caressing Tears, but the Moss Clump, which is the Rime Blue Moss, is kind of peculiar in that you don't receive any until mid-game, and that makes it pretty difficult for early and mid, and sometimes even late game, for people to cure. Alright, the only way you can reliably get any Rime Blue Moss Clumps is by handing in the Prisoner Chief's ashes from the Irithyll dungeon. But there is another way to cure Frostbite, which is being hit with any weapon that's a fire-based attack. And this one property of Frostbite makes it so good. This is where Frostbite becomes a good status effect to a great status effect, because you have two options you can choose whenever you want to deal with Frostbite. Do you want to deal burst damage, or do you want to cause a debuff? Which do you want to use? If you want to go for burst damage, just hit them with like a torch or a soldering iron, my personal favorite of course, and just reset their meter and then do it again. If you want to apply the debuff, don't mind any fire attacks, just let them deal with the proc. But keep this in mind, fire-based attacks only get rid of the Frostbite proc. It doesn't get rid of any buildup that's accumulated. For example, take a look at my bar. Frost is already procced, and once I got hit with the fire attack, it got removed. Now I'm gonna get hit again with another fire attack, but take notice, the bar doesn't get reset because the frost didn't proc. So don't worry about fire resetting all the progress you've done with your frost. So with all this being said, is Frostbite good? Yeah, I don't think anyone would object to that. The fact that you can choose two different ways to use Frostbite, as either burst damage or debuff, the weapons and spells able to proc frost so easily, and that most Irithyll weapons have high status buildup, I'd go so far as to say that Frostbite is arguably the best status effect in the game, just due to how easy it is to proc and the versatility it offers. That takes care of Poison and Frostbite, so let's move on to the king of status effects, or rather used to be, Bleed. What did I mean when I said that Bleed was the king of status effects? Well, let me bring back the 1.11 patch notes again and look at what changed for Bleed. Improve the bleed buildup of blood infusions, reduce bleed buildup of weapons not infused with bleed, decreased rate at which blood builds up when using Carthus Rouge. This patch was good for the statuses, but at first glance, it seems like Bleed was nerfed. But let's reminisce on the past of Bleed for a moment. During 2016 to about 2017, Bleed was the best status effect, due to a ton of things that were going for it. It had the most amount of weapons that did innate bleed, the weapons all did substantial bleed buildup, and Carthus Rouge did 45 bleed buildup to a buffable weapon. Compared to the other status effects at the time, Bleed was the greatest status effect. Being a burst damage status effect helped with taking out foes, possibly hiding behind a shield, or maybe an opponent that just needs that one extra hit to see a loading screen. Despite how good bleed was, some people got upset with bleed. But was it justified? Was lowering the effectiveness of bleed the answer to making it quote unquote balanced? No. And here's why. Bleed's effectiveness was just a symptom of a larger problem back then. Which were the weapons that dealt bleed? Anyone remember Hollow Unikiri, Warden Twin Blades, and the infamous Karthus Curved Sword? These weapons used to be the holy trinity of bleed builds. If a regular player wanted to make an effective bleed build, these three weapons were usually used. Unikiri and Wardens for the true combos they could do that already did a ton of damage, but then a bleed proc on top? Pretty disgusting. And Karthus Curved Sword was, well, admittedly that thing was strong even without bleed, but it definitely made it even stronger, that's for sure. There were a couple of other weapons that went under the radar but were still good because of bleed back in its heyday. Ever since this status patch and some weapon nerfs, bleed builds have seldom ever been seen outside of the occasional Warden Twin Blades buffed with Karthus Rouge. Even though bleed buildup was affected across the board, the actual damage that bleed caused was not changed. Bleed is a burst damage status effect, with the base damage that varies between a couple of factors, plus 15% of an opponent's total HP. The base damage can vary from the weapon level you're using, if the weapon is buffed with Karthus Rouge, or if your weapon is infused with a blood gem. Other than that, it's a rather straightforward status effect. Bleed is still usable despite these nerfs. In fact, let's take a look at what the patch exactly changed. One significant change that crippled bleed was the change of Karthus Rouge from an impressive 45 bleed buildup to a measly 20. To give an example of how low that is, if a character has 250 bleed resistance, it'll take 13 hits, or probably more, since bleed buildup will decrease a bit between hits, so more akin to roughly 18. Pretty absurd. The next change was decreasing the bleed buildup of all the weapons that did innate bleed. Although some weapons actually received a bleed buildup buff, not by much, but it's worth mentioning. But is bleed still usable in invasions? Of course. Although it's nowhere near as easy as it used to be, and I'm not going to say just use Warden Twin Blades with Karthus Rouge, because that's just the easiest to use on a bleed build. The truth that I've come to realize about bleed is that it requires a little more investment than the other status effects. Because of the weapons not dealing a significant amount of bleed buildup, and that Karthus Rouge doesn't, it's practically just non-existent to build up. What you are forced to use if you want to make a legitimate bleed build is to either go the easy route with the Wardens or Unikiris, any multi-hit weapon really. But if you don't want to do that, you either have to go two routes. Use a innate bleed weapon and Karthus Rouge on top. Or you could go the less traveled route and go with a bleed infused weapon that deals innate bleed. I chose to go with the former. Weapons that I think most of y'all would like are the Corvian Great Scythe, which is obvious, the Flamberge, and my personal favorite, Karthus Curved Greatsword. These weapons compared to other bleed weapons are less seen, mainly because of others in its class, or they're pretty tough to farm. I can say though, that these weapons, if you put time into learning them, you'll be successful at bleeding people out. The bleed weapon that I wish was more seen is the Karthus Curved Greatsword. Out of the two bleed weapons that have hyper armor on all of their attacks, Karthus Curved Greatsword is amazing. Compared to the other curved greatswords, it's probably less seen, but for a bleed build, this weapon is a cut above. People sleep on the weapon art, and I will admit it is tough to land out of neutral. But there is another use for the weapon art, and this goes back to my viewpoint of utility versus damage. To me, the weapon art isn't supposed to be entirely focused on damage, but rather it's more so for inflicting bleed buildup. Due to the fact that the weapon art does 3 hits, it does more buildup. And to best make use of this weapon art, I use a two-handed R1 into the full weapon art. Even though the last hit doesn't true combo, 9 out of 10 times it'll do a phantom hit, Doing this combo also works well with poison if you decide to use Ron Pine Resin instead of Carthus Rouge. And pairing another fast weapon in the offhand can also increase the effectiveness of the curved greatsword one-handed. For spells, there are two miracles you can use if you want to use them for bleed. Gnawing and Dory's Gnawing. Gnawing does 130 bleed buildup, while Dory's Gnawing does 210 bleed buildup. And even though I didn't use them, I can vouch for their effectiveness. And lastly, for curing bleed, there's 3 ways to cure it. Divine Blessing, Caressing Tears, or the Blood Red Moss Clump. So some final thoughts about bleed is, while I think it's a good status effect, especially at low level, compared to the other status effects, bleed kind of falls short once you get to the higher levels. And I'm going to touch upon why that is a little later on, but for right now I'll say bleed doesn't really have any other effects than just being a burst damage effect. And if they can roll the proc, which can also happen for Frostbite as well, but if you remember, Frostbite applies a debuff on the proc too. And for bleed, you get nothing out of it. You just miss out on a huge damage burst. And there's this really weird glitch or something that's going on with the coding or maybe the weapons, but sometimes I'll hit someone with the bleed weapon and the bleed proc will go off, but the damage won't apply. I don't know why. Maybe it's connection based, but if someone has an explanation, please tell us down in the comments if you do know. For the love of God, please do. Because it is the most... It feels like you're being robbed in this game. Out of all the things in the game, this is legitimately unfair. But anyways, I view bleed in the sense of it could really come in handy and come in clutch. Like sometimes I'll win invasions just from a bleed proc. And then other times that glitch will happen or they'll roll and then, then I have to start all over again. But if you can get past that, bleed can turn the tide. I hope through all of this that you gained some knowledge and maybe some uses for these status effects that maybe you didn't consider. Because we're almost at the end, but first, let's take a look at Toxic. This won't be as long as the other ones, don't worry. I'll keep this pretty brief. So Toxic in a sense is just a more powerful version of Poison. It is a damage over time status effect that lasts 60 seconds, deals damage during iframes, reduces stamina regen, and has a whopping base damage of 1,320 plus 0.1% of an opponent's total HP, making it the most damaging status effect in the game. Sounds pretty good, huh? So let's look at the tools available to us to inflict Toxic, shall we? Alright, wait. That's all there is? And that's the primary problem with Toxic. It's not the status itself, it's actually really good. It is the tools that Miyazaki gave us that are bad. The 3 things that we can use to inflict Toxic are Toxic Mist, Dung Pie, and Stalk Dung Pie. And 2 of the 3 are better as BM than actual tools. So how is Toxic Mist at inflicting Toxic? Unfortunately, all it is average, which is a problem whenever it's the only viable option for inflicting Toxic. But it can still be used. You just gotta know some tricks in order to do it. One property of Toxic Mist that you'll probably figure out for yourself if you've used it before, or if you're just starting out, is that the actual cloud itself actually goes through objects and walls. So the best way to use Toxic Mist is by catching a group or a person off guard by clipping the mist through the wall. In regular standard invasions to where it's just a PvE host and his phantoms that haven't played PvP before, or at least have very little experience, you'll be successful like probably 70% of the time, or probably more if you practice enough. But don't get your hopes up in 1v1s. You're probably not going to get anywhere close to proccing Toxic. As for curing Toxic, it's a different story compared to other status effects. Yes, it can be cured with Divine Blessings, but remember that Caressing Tears can only cure the proc, it doesn't cure the buildup, unlike other status effects. And it can also be cured by the moss associated with it, which is Blooming Purple Moss. And that's basically all to say about Toxic. It's a better poison. It does better damage, and plus it has a debuff. It has the same utility and everything, but it's just so frustrating that they made it so good, but they just gave us the most garbage tools to inflict with. And don't get me wrong, I'm not angry. It's more of a just like, why? Why make it so good but make it unrealistically difficult to proc it in a PvP situation? In PvE I can understand, but in a PvP situation you can pretty much forget it unless you can get the drop on someone. Or maybe I'm just making a big deal out of it, which I possibly am, but compared to the others, Toxic is definitely the toughest to proc with. Although it is definitely one of the strongest among the four. So possibly that could be, the balance. But I'll leave how good Toxic is up to you. Well, we've finally come to the end of explaining status effects. From Poison, to Frostbite, to Bleed, and to Toxic. For the final portion of this video, I'm going to be talking about some different things involving the status effects as a whole. I wanted to leave this portion towards the end of the video since it gives me a little more freedom to bounce around the status effects, if you get what I mean. I didn't really touch upon whether a status-focused build is viable in invasions. Doesn't matter if it's a Bleed, Poison, Frostbite, or even a Toxic build. While yes, I do believe these statuses all have their functions and uses and can even win invasions, is a status build a good build in invasions? And the truth is, you don't make a status build. Or, at least, not in the way you think. See, whenever I hear people talk about making a Poison, a Bleed, or Frostbite build, they think that their procs are going to win them their invasions, or they're going to play a significant role in completing an invasion. And the truth of the matter is, no, it's not going to do that. And while yes, you may have those invasions to where those statuses can really turn the tide, majority of the time, they're not going to win the invasion for you. What I learned through these status effects and playing around with them in invasions in various soul levels is think of statuses as icing on the cake. Don't make a build solely for status effects. Make a build that has status effects that rewards being aggressive. And that's the key, is to be aggressive. And in those gank situations, I understand how difficult it can be to be aggressive. Believe me, I've been there time and time again. But it all comes down to being aggressive. Keeping your opponent from curing their status effect with a moss, or letting their buildup go away. And focusing on a status build could possibly make you more aggressive as a result. So if you're a passive, backpedaling sword and board player that cares about your kill-death ratio, then try this out. Maybe it can help you see a new playstyle that you may prefer. Also, don't sacrifice damage for a status effect. I've seen so many people suggest just infusing your weapon with a status gem, whether it be Poison or Bleed. Don't do it. I don't recommend it at all. Due to the fact that statuses are relatively easy to cure, if they do that, you've sacrificed all that buildup and you've done barely any damage due to it. The only circumstance I would recommend having a weapon infused with a status gem is if 1. You have a duplicate, and 2. If you know your opponent is close to having a status proc. I should also mention that stats affect your resistance towards a certain status effect. Vigor, endurance, and vitality all govern resistance towards a certain status effect. Vigor to frost, endurance to bleed, and vitality to poison and toxic. It won't be noticeable until you hit 30 in that stat, but once it hits 30, you really start to notice the increase. So you might also want to keep in mind the soul level you're going to, because say for instance at meta level, most players are probably going to have the soft cap for the stats I just mentioned. Once you're in those high soul level invasions, damage from status effects start to drop off, and once that happens, you really want to start looking at what other things it brings to the table besides damage. This is why I enjoy using poison and frostbite at higher soul levels, because of the other things that they can do to my opponent besides damage. And this is why I feel like bleed falls short to poison and frostbite once you hit those higher soul levels. At mid to low soul levels, bleed is just fine though. But what if I told you that there was a way to make each status effect usable at any soul level? And I'm not saying that I'm the first one to think about this, but just in case you may have not thought about it yourself, I want to bring it up to you in case you haven't. Why not combine each status in a build? Having a weapon in your main hand that does innate bleed, that is buffed with raw pine resin, and having a Irithil weapon in your offhand. That way you have access to 3 of the 4 status effects. And you have additional pressure due to all the statuses you're inflicting. Think about it. Your opponent is going to see 3 status bars whenever you hit them with both of your weapons. And then, bam, they're inflicted with poison. And then what do you know? They're trying to cure it, and then bam, they got frostbite, and they have a debuff. And then they're gonna try and cure their poison and their frostbite, and then you finish them off with a bleed proc from your innate bleed weapon. I cannot tell you how much fun I've had with statuses with this setup. My 2 personal favorite setups involving this playstyle is main hand Karthus Curve Greatsword, and then offhand Irithil Straight Sword. In your main hand, you have a hyper armor weapon that does innate bleed that can be buffed with either Ron Pine Resin or Karthus Rouge. And in your offhand, you have a straight sword that does innate frost and has a ton of range. The other weapon setup that I've been enjoying quite a lot is the Narcolept setup. Although his uses Gales plus the regular rapier, I use the Flamberge and the Irithil rapier. So those are 2 setups that I've come up with. If you have any that you may want to share, go ahead and let me know, but these are the ones that are the most comfortable for me. Some other information that I wanted to share is a weapon that people may have not thought about involving statuses, which is the Crow Quills. The weapon is great already, but buffing it with poison, bleed, or frost is actually a viable way to inflict a status effect. The multi-hits of the L1s inflict a ton of buildup, but the bread and butter lies with the weapon are knives. Although the knives are weak, they do buildup equal to the amount of status buffed on your weapon. So if you buff it with a raw pine resin, it'll do 45 poison buildup on a knife. So if you hit someone point blank with all 4 knives, you'll do 180 poison buildup. Another good combo is R1 into L1. Although it may be inconsistent, it's a relatively safe combo to do. And I owe finding out about this to Sir Grey, and also a huge thank you to Yuko for helping test this out.
I'm gonna eat you. I will eat you. I will absolutely eat you.
Also, if you're going to be invading at low levels, I'd recommend to try and hit at least 220 frostbite resistance, since this will allow you to tank an R1 combo from Vorts, which does 110 buildup with each R1. But the buildup will disappear enough between the 2 R1s, so you'll be safe. Trust me when I say you'll see more than a fair share at low soul levels since it's easy to obtain. And if you want to know how multi-hit weapons are affected by a status, take the amount of status that's shown to you and then multiply it by 0.75. Then multiply it by 2 because an L1 has 2 strikes in it. For example, if Wardens has 30 bleed and you hit someone with an L1, it'll do 45 bleed buildup instead. Another tip is that you can buff your offhand weapon as long as you two-hand it. It's useful for applying various status effects or maybe just an extra damage buff. Just make sure to two-hand it and buff it first and then your main hand, not vice versa. Alright, well, that takes care of everything I pretty much wanted to cover. Except for one thing though, which is the stat that governs status buildup. Luck. And I didn't talk about it in this video because this one is already way too long, but perhaps in the future I could do a follow-up video to this one and try and see if Hollow is really worth it or not. Although I only did a Hollow build at SL56, I kind of want to see how it holds up at meta, because at meta and just higher soul levels in general, status, if you're not going to put any investment into it, kind of falls short, and it's a lot harder to proc a status effect. Other than that, I hope you learned something. If you didn't, if you already knew all this stuff, then well gee, I feel like a dummy, but I just wanted to share this just in case, and especially in this late of the game's life cycle, and we don't know when the next Souls game is going to be announced or released, I figured that any video, whether it be big or small, is going to be helpful in this drought of Souls content. So I hope you enjoyed this video that's been 40 minutes long. Oh my. Yeah, I'm through. Anyways, this has been Derpy. I'll see you guys later.